Because of our less than calm social climate, defining political ideology today seems like we have to solve for an asymptote, or at least it's something that apparently requires debate and consensus. But that's exactly the problem. The approach for defining political ideology should be objectivity, not consensus. So our objective here is to try to be objective. In that spirit, understand that this is a video posted on YouTube. It is nothing beyond that. It is not the exhaustive collection of all things to do with corporatism. It's the establishment of a definition, an attempt at clarity, a starting point for those interested. A journey into any political ideology requires work. This is a YouTube video. Watching it does not constitute work. Now, a corporatist would appreciate that introduction. So, what is corporatism? Doesn't it mean a government dominated by big business and corporations? Or does it mean government that is run like a corporation, whatever that means? And to those who have read a bit of political theory and history, isn't it just the economic side of fascism? Addressing all of those questions, the answer is no. Corporatism is in fact a distinct political and economic conception. In burying those questions, it places business firmly in its place. Whoever asks this is understandably confusing it with corptocracy, which has no relation here. To the statement that it means running a country like a business, if this is meant to imply oligarchical or some hyper-neoliberal capitalistic approach to nationhood, it's directly opposed to those things. And lastly, no, corporatism is distinct from fascism. In fact, it predates fascism, so that argument too is buried. Corporatism is a political ideology and economic system that is envisioned as a response to both the liberal and collectivist conceptions of life and politics. Now, this is not a video on those two ideologies, but because corporatism is literally constructed out of a rejection of those two, we must visit them briefly. In the liberal state, we accept the existence of different groups and interests, and indeed differences down to the individual level, and understand that conflict or competition is part of the natural order. Individuals and groups are welcome to engage in the pursuit of property or happiness and live their lives as they choose, providing that they do not encroach or infringe on the liberty of others. The role of the state is to ensure that the rules of the game are maintained. Meanwhile, in the collectivist conception of state, the role of the state is different. Rather than only maintaining the rule of law, the state is a vehicle by which the nation can be propelled towards a set of social goals. Because the state is inanimate, the population must be mobilized for this end. And if the moral goal is usually some degree of equality, then it is a relatively straightforward process to divide the population into exploiter and the exploited, and to use the momentum of the exploited via their revolution towards equality or whatever goal is set. In the Marxist flavor, it's the proletariat, the downtrodden working classes, the toilers, marching against the bourgeoisie to achieve their socialist utopia, as I'm sure you know. Now, both conceptions, despite being opposite in the treatment of individuality, do have some things in common. For instance, they are both progressive and future-facing at the ideological level. What we are going to focus on, though, is the acceptance and indeed the inevitability of conflict. The level of conflict being positioned at the class or the individual level is irrelevant. They both consider conflict, or in the liberal words, competition, to be inherent as a means to fulfillment. Corporatism, by contrast, puts stability before progress. It does not reject progress outright, but it does not mystify progress in the way that the other two do. Progress is encouraged at the practical level, not the ideological level. You could say that a corporatist scientifically approaches progress, while the spiritual or ideological level encourages stability, and now to use a corporatist word, harmony. Diving a level deeper, corporatism borrows a few major concepts, they would argue the best concepts, from the liberal and collectivist conceptions. The first, from the liberal state, is that individual liberty is a general good, and that competition is the best way to encourage economic advancement. From the collectivist state, borrowed is the idea that class conflict is inevitable, something that the liberal state likes to turn the blind eye to. Furthermore, here, corporatism believes that the open playing field of the liberal state will be good for some, but for most it will create a crisis of meaning in the form of existential anxiety in the modern world and a loss of purpose. The atomization of liberalism, where the individual is a featureless atom vis-a-vis the state, is bound to be ripe for the greedy capitalist to exploit, or the collectivist demagogue to radicalize. The corporatist idea is to resolve these problems through organization, by structuring the economy, and consequently society, into cultural and real, legally sanctioned associations. You can create communities that modern society desperately needs. Another way to think about this is that whereas the other two conceptions have a breakout of society on horizontal lines by class, the corporatist state wishes to organize society by category, not class. In the corporate state, each association unites workers and employers of a specific vocation or industry. Each association is then hierarchical, so it may contain several subsidiary associations based on geography or niche and so on. Each association is further divided into two legally equal associations of employers and employees. It is the synthesis of these two legally equal associations that resolve the class conflict. The corporate state rejects the violent revolution of the collectivist state as being counterproductive, literally in this case, and figuratively. The idea of the collaboration between these two associations is to carry class conflict away from the factory floor, away from the guillotine, and into a legal framework of equals, where conflicts can be resolved at their respective level, wherever they exist. The role of the corporate state itself is to set the national pace and direction, and to resolve conflicts as a sort of tiebreaker if the employer and employee associations deadlock. The state, besides setting the tone, maintains its position in general or umbrella matters, while the associations are to be master in their sphere and in specific matters. The state additionally serves as a sort of watchdog over employer monopoly power, egoism, exploitation, as well as checking the power of unions and the politicization of the masses. In this way, with conflict being held in place via legal structure, citizens become much more part of the state and are able to obtain levels of leadership, direction, and purpose in their own sphere of knowledge. You have a nation now, in theory, not where everyone is running all over the place, attempting to enrich themselves at the expense of others, scraping together their bucket of money at all costs, or a dictatorship attempting to create some unrealistic utopia, but rather a state that rightfully consists of different parts, vocations, interests, initiatives, all operating as one body. Body in Latin is corpus, hence corporatism. In the theories and literature, you will see association and corporation being used interchangeably to describe these economic and cultural units. Some may recognize a related and more senior conception known as syndicalism, but please, that's a topic for another day. So, what is the political appeal? This ideology seems like it would turn off the ambitious capitalist who wants to dominate industry and the revolutionary Marxist who wants to overthrow the bourgeoisie and usher in the socialist utopia. Well, quickly consider our theoretical corporate state again. You now have a whole new level of the state, not one that is concerned with demagoguery or paper pushing, but one that gives people in their vocation a new degree of power. Remember, the associations or the corporations comprise the actual people in those vocations. They're not professional bureaucrats, so it gives workers and employers both the chance to direct, impact, and improve their respective industry. Having this more direct environment in which to operate and the state-sanctioned ability to impact their actual world is appealing to a certain group. Consider as well the violent revolution of the collectivist state, or even a non-violent form of collectivism. Which same group is set to lose the most? The wealthy can buy their way out and flee the country, and in theory the lowest classes rise. But who usually loses the most? And who is usually the most vocal about the crisis of democracy, the failures of assembly, and can see, and did see, corporatism as a path away from these failures, with the opportunity to pull power away from both the corrupt politician, the useless bureaucrat, but all the while not flipping the entire board upside down? The answer is the middle class. You should probably be able to guess by now how the corporatist voting structure works. You got it. Integrating the corporations. As every citizen in that vocation is a member, the citizen can choose to vote and engage in politics in their respective category of expertise. This way, as one corporatist put it through an analogy, you don't have a layman walking into an engineer's office, studying the room for 5 minutes, and then start telling them what to do. In the modern world, problems are complex, and the great weakness of democracy is the tendency for professional politicians to boil down complex problems into repeatable slogans or win elections through debate. For goodness sake, a corporatist would say, debate and elections actually solve nothing. We should respect people's intelligence by allowing them to exercise power and be active in their own area of knowledge. The corporations elect members to go and represent the entire corporate body at the national governance, so the assembly becomes a categorical, vertical assembly, rather than the horizontal assemblies of democracy, which are nominally based on geography, but in reality just formulate a class of professional politician. We define the general theme of corporatism, or at least you are picking up what it's aiming at. Now, it is not the intent of this overview to cover the nations and the statesmen who have attempted to put it into practice. That would be a history video, and this is not that. Recall from the introduction, we are defining theory. We're covering an ideology as objectively as possible. But let's cheat slightly on that rule and discuss the connection with fascism, as a few students of political science and history would be keen to get some clarification on that. The connection with fascism is actually quite straightforward. Fascism was also born out of a rejection of the liberal and collectivist states, so it made sense for theorists to borrow from contemporary Allied conceptions, at least in principle. Except, slight problem, and this is not a video about fascism, and maybe one day we'll cover that subject, but spoiler alert, Mussolini wasn't really an administrator type, and that's putting it lightly. In fact, I would even make the argument that the entire ideological foundation of Italian fascism, while as legitimate as any written ideology should be analyzed, was retroactively applied, or not even applied, in Italy, overshadowed by what amounted to Mussolini's personal dictatorship. Now, the enthusiasm for corporatism was real and genuine early in the Italian regime, especially among big corporatist advocates employed by the regime. The way Italy navigated the Depression was seemingly better than many other states, and how Mussolini was so open and dynamic was fascinating to foreign observers. But on corporatism, he dragged his feet. It slowly drifted into being through a series of laws that stretched out over a decade, but by this time, the mid-1930s, things had changed from their scientific, idealized beginnings. Mussolini hadn't yet, but in due time would drift into Germany's influence, and you know the rest. The corporate state, while finally enacted as a series of hollow shells, just became another level of bureaucracy that Mussolini was using to control his personal fiefdom, with everything essentially operating as before. It wasn't even like the logo just got swapped in the building, it was even more underwhelming than that. As one Italian observer put it, finding corporatism in Italy was like searching a dark room for a black cat that isn't there. And as Hayek would proclaim, most states, even liberal ones, transform into a real collectivist standard in wartime, as the state must literally move in order to survive. When the war did get kicked off, any faint glimmer of a continuation of the corporatist project just vanished. Many early 20th century leaders, not all of them fascists, copied and pasted a bit from Mussolini, who was actually quite universally admired early in his reign. For example, Salazar had a portrait of Mussolini on his desk even, until it was removed in the 1930s. Salazar also began to implement a corporate state in his nation, Portugal, And the academic and more solemn Salazar probably gives us a better example of corporatism in practice. Salazar was also patient with establishing it, but not because he was distracted by consolidating power like his Italian one-time idol and contemporary. He was pragmatic and wanted the nation to culturally accept the economic reorganization, like putting up scaffolding before construction. But slowly up it went, with Salazar admitting that he was experimenting with the best way to steer a corporate state, even though its principles began to slowly come into being. For example, when a large fishing industry magnate ignored direction to not attempt to roll up the industry and price smaller fishermen out of business, Salazar had him corrected, fined, and imprisoned briefly. He tended to do this and side with the small businesses when compromise wasn't met between the smaller and larger firms. But Salazar also had to take emergency measures to keep his nation out of the Second World War, which he did successfully despite much pressure. But those same statist efforts included things like rationing and more direct control over the economy, which started the slippage away from the corporate program, and it just never really got back on the rails. Foreign policy was an existential distraction or a convenient excuse to get away from the program, depending on whose opinion you get. Finding other genuine examples in history is harder. Economists certainly borrowed features, and you could even claim that the economies of the Nordic states, Austria, and the Netherlands have a quasi-corporatist nature to them. The authoritarian regime in Argentina after the war also attempted to establish a corporate state, and you can also draw a continuation from the guild tradition in many European countries. In fact, some economists eager to take a new look on corporatism have decided to split the concept in two, with old corporatism being the model with state control being senior in setting the pace versus neo-corporatism, a model where the associations themselves are on a more equal playing field with the state, often called corporatism from below, something that kind of resembles those syndicates that we mentioned earlier. It is worth calling out the observation that most modern conceptions of corporatism view it mainly as an economic order rather than an all-encompassing political ideology as it was in the prior century. 17 texts, plus additional source material such as the charters and laws forming the corporate states in Italy and Portugal, went into our truncated overview of this strange ideology and economic order that never really saw the light of full practice. Naturally, I couldn't cover everything. Simplifying political studies and history and saying that's sufficient is a symptom of the expediency of our age. I made this starting point because theories considering how we ought to structure our state and our lives deserve as much attention and conversation as we desire to give it. Or does it? What are you supposed to be doing right now? Working? Obviously, you are a political science student or aspiring statesman, because otherwise you wouldn't stray out of your category. If you have questions, I will be glad to answer them, providing that your question is structured, orderly, and does not encourage conflict in the comment section.